Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this month's webinar, which is a topic that is very, very relevant at the moment, all to do with trade unions and how to approach working with them. So before we start, we would like to introduce ourselves. And as you can see on the slide here, we are joined by Sue Watson, Head of Client Services. Sue will be helping me with the polls and the questions at the end. Drew Nagis is support in the background. Should there be any technical problems, but hopefully, finger crossed, there won't be. And I'm Victoria Templeton, HR Knowledge Manager here at HR Solutions. And because we've got lots of you who've joined us today, we've had to place you all on mute, but as usual, we do want to hear your questions. So when you see this slide at the end, this means that we're at the stage of being able to take your live questions. And I'm going to just run through quickly how you can submit those. So on the screen now, you'll see an image of what your GoToWebinar panel screen looks like. So just please type your question in the question pane. And as I said, we'll aim to read out and answer as many as we can at the end. And when you see this slide, it means that we shall be running a confidential poll in which we seek your input, which will help and make the webinar more informative. And this slide is just to set out what we're going to be covering today. And I think the first thing to say is that in order to understand how to work with trade unions, it's important to first understand the current employment climate that we're working in. I'm going to be setting out the role of trade unions and the role they play within an organisation, which again is another important consideration for understanding how best to work alongside them. And of course, knowing your employees' legal rights is also important too, for avoiding any unnecessary conflict and challenge. And then from a high level perspective, I'm going to cover off what it means to recognise a union in terms of what happens when you receive a request to do so, which then leads us to think about the actual relationship and what it takes to build and maintain those effective industrial relations in your workplace. And so to begin with, we're going to consider the employment climate that we're working in, as it has certainly changed over the last few years. And before we do, we're going to just run a couple of quick polls just to sort of understand the context and what's everybody's situation at the moment who is on this webinar. So if I can invite you to call up the first poll, and it's about whether you are currently recognising a trade union.
There we go. That's ready.
Thank you. So let's see, so yes or no, or no, but you're currently dealing with a request for recognition, as I know we are seeing those happening. So we'll just leave it a few more moments to see what's happening.
Okay, I think we're just about there.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, let's see what the results are.
Just close that poll and share the results with you. So there you go.
Okay, so yeah, okay. So probably more than what I thought. 58% of you do recognise a union, 39% no, and actually 3% of you are actually currently dealing with a request. And I'm sure you're probably well aware that it's a very complex process and time consuming and can take a great deal of time to work through, which we will come on to later in the webinar. So thank you for that. And then the second part of the poll is, for those of you who don't recognise a trade union, who do, sorry, please best describe the relationship that you have with them. Would you say it's good and effective, a working relationship, or it's okay but needs to be improved, or do you feel that it's a poor, ineffective working relationship? So let's see, a few more seconds.
I think we're probably
just
about there now. Okay, I'll close that poll and share the results.
Okay, so it's good to hear 41% of you feel that you have a good, effective working relationship with your unions, and generally 59% of you, it's okay. Obviously, there's room for improvement there. So we can, as we go through, you'll sort of, I guess we'll focus on the working relationship and building and maintaining that. So that's good, and it's very good to hear that there's not one of you that feels that you've got that poor, ineffective working relationship. And I think nowadays things are perhaps different to years gone by, aren't they, with the whole relationship of working with unions.
Absolutely.
So I think that's the last poll in this section, so I'm just going to move on. And it's really important, as I said a moment ago, to understand the employment climate, because it continues to evolve and it's having to respond to several significant and volatile, not just domestic influences, but global influences too. You know, and first of all, I think, you know, we very much are aware of COVID-19. We're obviously in that recovery phase of coming out from that pandemic. Restrictions have been removed, but businesses are still continuing to rebuild following that pandemic. And for some, it may be having to make some really tough decisions around the organisational structure, and therefore, you know, what roles are still required, etc. So that's one external influence that we need to be mindful of. We also have uncertainty around employment legislation. You may be aware that we've had several employment bills put forward in the last few years, such as a bill around neonatal leave and pay, carers leave, dismissal and re-engagement, how workers receive tips, for example. But much of Parliament's business of the last 2 years has been severely impacted for obvious reasons. So consequently, many of those bills and employment legislation that have been due to come into force haven't. So that's another consideration we need to be mindful of in terms of the landscape with potential trade unions. And also, we've had recently news of a new bill being introduced, which is the Retained EU Law Reform Bill. And that's all to do with, should it be passed, about bringing a significant overhaul of UK employment law next year, because it essentially is going to repeal all the existing EU legislation that many of our domestic UK law is based on. So if you think about the working time regulations, that comes from your working time directive. We have the TUPE regulations, part-time workers, GDPR. All of these domestic pieces of legislation will be impacted by this bill, because essentially the UK government want to write their own legislation and not have any reference or link to previous EU law. So obviously, these pieces of regulations, legislation, provide employment protection for workers and employees. So there'll be no doubt whatsoever that this bill in particular will be at the forefront of the minds of the trade unions over the coming year, because we are expecting to see significant changes. You know, even you hear, obviously it's all rumours and press at the moment, but you hear potentially of removing the opt-out part of the working time regulations in the name to enhance productivity. You know, if that was to come about, then clearly that's a massive, massive change for how we operate and work. So that's definitely something that is going to be on the union's radar. We're also experiencing the significant cost of living crisis with the threat of a recession, and some industries or businesses are already saying that the UK is already in a recession. So this means businesses are looking at their budgets, finding ways to save money, which for some unfortunately leaves no option but to consider redundancies, even closures. We're also seeing wages stagnate and not be in line with rates of inflation, which are at phenomenal levels, and employers are not being able to provide the benefits and rewards that employees desire or even need. So it's a big external influence there. And in terms of, if we think about staff turnover, we do continue to experience challenges with recruitment, retention, and with employees feeling the impact of the economic challenges. You know, it does lead them to considering actually employment elsewhere, where they can get that higher pay and better benefits. And we must also be mindful of the increase in mental ill health that we've seen recently, especially on the back of the pandemic. But now we have the cost of living crisis, we have higher food, fuel costs, high UK interest rates. All of these factors risk the mental health and well-being of our employees. And if not effectively supported, can lead to higher absence levels for businesses, or if people try and remain at work and struggle trying to deal with it by being at work still, then you can see performance issues, and potentially you may end up with grievances if the employee perceives that their health isn't being supported appropriately. And of course, we also continue to hear news about industrial action. The latest announcement was yesterday, in fact, and that's about the nurses having been balloted and will be going on strike later this year. And there's also talk that it could even go into next year. But having, regardless of the putting aside the nurses, I think going into 2023 in general, it's to be expected that we're going to hear more and more about industrial action. So that's important to take into account. And as you can see here on the slide, 2022 has been a year of a lot of industrial action, ballots for industrial action in many different areas. So, as you can see here, the National Rail and London Underground, in fact, London Underground are on strike today. Barristers, postal service, universities, it goes on. So we are seeing an employment climate where trade unions, industrial action is very, very paramount and very, very on the agenda in terms of employment. And it's probably fair to say that we would typically associate trade unions with the public sector, but did you know that 40% of trade union members actually work in the private sector? And that's something that was reported earlier this year. And with the employment climate we're now operating in, it does raise serious questions for employers for the coming months and into 2023. So first of all, are we going to see membership levels increase? And therefore, will employers see more union representation in their formal management processes? Your disciplinary hearings, your grievance meetings, performance management and absence meetings. We also need to be mindful that could we see an increase in employment tribunal claims, given that as a trade union member you have greater access to legal advice and support in respect of tribunal claims. They will pursue your case for you and help support represent you at tribunal. And finally, will businesses start to see an increase in requests for recognition? So clearly from the poll, 3% of you are dealing with currently a request for recognition. We're hearing from our clients that, there's requests coming through. We're also experiencing and hearing that many more union representations, informal meetings are taking place as well. So there is a lot more union activity that we're seeing this year, and as I said, likely to continue going into next year. But what is the role of trade unions? Having that understanding of the role they play will help in the development and maintaining of that relationship, and that's what we're going to look at next. And so I've just mentioned that 40% of trade union members work in the private sector, likely to be going up over the coming months. And clearly there is going to be a direct link between the employment climate that I've just spoken about and trade union membership. And we do expect membership levels to continue increasing. Now, a trade union's overall purpose, as everybody will know, is to serve in the best interests of its members by protecting their workers' rights and encouraging equality, diversity and inclusion in the workplace. So with everything that we've just talked about, with what's going on externally, both domestically for the UK, but also globally, it's probably without doubt that we're going to see more and more take-up of trade union. And in terms of industrial action, the trade unions will ballot its members, and I guess what we're hearing about in the news is very much all to do with the strikes. Strikes, even if they don't affect your business directly because it's not your own workforce, your workers can be impacted indirectly through strike action. So it's about thinking about when there is planned strikes, how can you help support your employees? For example, you know, if they're struggling to get into work because of the network, the rail network and things like that. But strike action isn't the only form of industrial action. There could be something called work to rule, where they're literally only doing what they have to. There's also actions such as go slow, putting a ban for workers working overtime, or even call out. So there's different ways in which trade unions rather, can suggest industrial action, and it will generally be when negotiations have fallen down, and it's their way of saying change needs to happen. And having a clear understanding of the issues to be negotiated and what your trade union needs to be informed on are fundamental to the relationship that you have. So when a union is recognised and there's that legal right to conduct collective bargaining, and that refers to the two parties negotiations, it's typically on pay, hours, holidays, although other issues may be agreed between the two parties. And collective bargaining is that process in which a union and employer will negotiate, and the output then is your collective agreement with your recognised trade union, and that agreement is providing that clarity of the understanding of how both parties are to work together and to negotiate moving forward those employment terms that form part of the collective bargaining. In terms of a collective agreement, then typically that would include how negotiations will be organised, who will represent employees, which employees are to be covered by the agreement. It may not be the whole workforce, and then obviously which terms and conditions to be covered. So like I've said, pay and benefits, could be around discipline, allocation of work, terms and conditions of work, or even facilities for officials of trade unions. And working effectively with trade unions is vital. Through working collaboratively, you can achieve that balance. So from a business perspective, the business becomes supported in delivering its business goals through its people, and unions will feel that their members continue to be managed in line with fair working practices, benefits, and have their rights protected. And if you think about it, the ultimate goal for both sides is for that successful business. Clearly the business wants to be successful, but a trade union also wants that business to be successful, because that's what provides employment in the community and protects employment. So ultimately both parties will want the same thing, but it's how they achieve that and how they go about it that's obviously the tricky bit, the balancing act. And so if we think about the next stage, and this is around the legal rights of employees, if we think about trade unions, and I think it's important to just distinguish at this point that the difference between trade union membership and trade union recognition. So the business does not need to recognise a union for its employees to join and become a member. So many of you will probably be familiar through your formal management processes like disciplinaries. Employees have the right to be represented in that meeting by a certified union rep. Even though the business doesn't recognise a union, it is ultimately a statutory right for an individual. So it's just important to distinguish that you don't have to be recognising, your organisation doesn't need to recognise a union for employee to become a member. So as a member of a trade union, you know, it gives the right to take industrial action. Employees cannot be forced to stay at or go back to work. Taking industrial action is effectively the employee breaching their contract of employment, but which is probably a weird thing, because on the one hand it's everybody's got the right to strike and take industrial action, yet ultimately it is breaching that contract. It just means that on a practical level the employee does not receive pay for work not undertaken. I guess theoretically there's a claim that an employer can pursue the breach of contract, but in reality that doesn't happen because of the time and effort what's involved. So essentially the employee has the right to industrial action, but the pay is not given for work not undertaken. And taking part in industrial action is also likely to reduce an individual's length of service. So it will reduce the service by the number of days the employee was on strike. So employees themselves must really bear in mind the impact of any actions and participation in industrial action, because the impact on things such as pension and any other statutory benefits that rely on their length of service. Employees cannot be dismissed for taking action or given action short of dismissal connected with their union membership or activities. They can claim unfair dismissal if dismissed within the 12 weeks from when the industrial action took place, and they can't have employment refused because of union membership or activities, and also cannot be selected for redundancy on the grounds of being a member of the trade union or involved in trade union activities. So we're now going to look at recognition, and I think the thing I would say with recognition, and the 3% of you here on the call probably understand, is it is complicated. So it's very complex from a legal point of view. It's very timely. So for the purpose of today's webinar, I'll at high level just explain the principles and what's involved, but there is a lot more to it. So in terms of the recognition, a trade union can seek it through either a voluntary route or statutory. In general, it is better to voluntarily recognise a trade union rather than being forced and having that request managed through the statutory route, which I'll come on to highlight. Because I suppose if you think about it, you know, you both want the same thing, a successful business that provides employment in the community. And if you can have that working relationship that is built on you both want the same thing, you have the same mindset, doing that voluntarily is far better than a situation where one party feels forced down a route to be in that situation. It's going to be more engaging and more effective as a relationship, but it doesn't always work out that way, as I'm sure some of you may know if you're in that situation. So in terms of recognition, the process that is followed can take at least 6 months. So really, employers should consider how their relationships with their trade union, as well as their workforce, is to be managed throughout that process of disruption. So it's really, really important to sort of focus on that. What then happens is there's something called the first period. And so when you get that request from a trade union to become recognised, you have 10 days in which to respond, whereby you either agree or you agree to negotiate further, or you refuse. Now, if the employer agrees to recognition, the parties will agree what's called a bargaining unit and agree that the union is recognised and entitled to conduct collective bargaining on behalf of that unit. There's no need to continue with that strategy. It's just statutory procedure because union recognition has been granted, and that's, I guess, the end of that process. You've managed to agree it, done so voluntarily. But if the employer rejects the request but is willing to negotiate, the parties may continue to conduct those negotiations for a further 20 days, and this stage is called the second period. That can be extended past the 20 days, but both parties must agree. And then ultimately, where no agreement is reached, the trade union may refer the matter to the Central Arbitration Committee, CAC, which now becomes formally involved. And the trade union must have a membership level of at least 10% of the proposed bargaining unit in order to participate. So with the CAC, this is the third period, which is known as an appropriate period. And again, it's a period of 20 days or longer as agreed or ordered, sorry, by the CAC. And ultimately, the Central Arbitration Committee both are there to help both sides in reaching that agreement and in making specific decisions. So the CAC must try to help the employer and the trade union reach that agreement on the appropriate bargaining unit. And if the CAC decides the union's proposal is appropriate, then that's an end to the matter and recognition has been introduced. So this means that employers have only one chance to point out the problems and why the proposed bargaining unit does not meet that statutory criteria. But if the CAC doesn't consider the proposed unit to be appropriate, then it must make its own ruling on what is appropriate in terms of a bargaining unit, and that has to be within the 10 days of the expiry of the appropriate period. So as I said, it is complex and lengthy. There are further stages and elements to it, depending on how the matter evolves. But essentially, as part of the statutory process, it will involve balloting of its members, but ultimately the CAC can impose a method as to how collective bargaining will be conducted. So I think you can get a sense from that summary that it really is in probably both parties' interests to voluntarily go through and recognise a trade union. But I appreciate it may not be always right for every business, and each business has to make its own decision in terms of its industry, its workforce, the employment economic climate, and how it manages its people. So that's, I guess, a high level sort of summary of the recognition. And if we think about working with trade unions, then the employer competence in managing that working relationship is paramount in ensuring that the business needs can be met. So trust is really, really important, because without trust, it's going to become harder for the business goals to be achieved and likely to lead to that conflict. You can build trust by having those shared goals. So I talked about, ultimately trade unions want employment to be maintained in their community, and for the businesses, they want to retain that successful business. So ultimately, both parties are working towards the same outcome. So entering negotiations where both parties seek the same outcome makes the desired aims more achievable and hopefully implemented more swiftly. So it's in the interest of both the trade union and employer to build those good relations. So for employers, the fact that the union supports members in other organisations, let's just leave that there, sorry. There we go. So for employers, the fact that the union supports members not in other organisations, not just yours, can be hugely beneficial. They can bring insights from what's happening across your industry and in similar workplaces. And therefore, what that does is bring you a broader perspective on current employment economic issues. Having that single point of contact to negotiate terms, conditions, and to deal with people issues can be a more effective use of management time, and it can actually make it much more simpler than dealing with employees separately. Recognising a trade union can also lead to a more engaged workforce, because by consulting with a union on the terms and conditions of their employment, your employees are more likely to feel that they're involved in the way in which the business is run and feel like they're contributing to that. And furthermore, negotiating on terms and conditions encourages trust and commitment from the workforce. But what about the skills and behaviours that are needed to build and maintain that effective relationship? Well, taking part in a partnership approach to the relationship is significant. You're both invested in that successful business that I mentioned, and a successful business can only come about through its people. Both parties are in support of that successful business, and it also is important that both parties have respect for each other in terms of the issues and how they're handled, because ultimately having respect for each other will encourage the trust and confidence, which is vital in the overall relationship. Having regular communication is also vital, as this builds an open and honest relationship that's founded on trust on both sides. But also it helps both parties to know what the fundamental issue is, that it's the heart of the dispute. Keeping an open mind is essential too, so don't prejudge or go into any negotiations with a limited view and opinion. Remember what I said in terms of the unions bring a broad perspective of current issues across the sector, so they may come up with ideas that perhaps you haven't thought of. And finally, share ideas earlier. Unions want to know that you're genuine in your intentions to negotiate, that sharing ideas at the earliest possible stage can then allow them to build their trust in the organisation and truly believe that you are genuine in the partnership approach to the relationship. So we're going to move to a quick poll before we're going to look to see if you have any questions that Sue and I can help answer. So Sue, if you could kindly call up the next poll. And if you received a request for recognition today, just bearing in mind what we've sort of talked about, how we see 2023 evolving, would you become unionised, or would your organisation become unionised, do you think? Yes, no, or unsure?
I think we're just about there now.
Yep.
I'll close up and share it.
See what the results are. Okay, you shared them? Can't see.
Yep,
So
they're
there. So 39% have said yes and unsure, and 22% no. So that's interesting information, actually, to hear that almost 40% of you would become unionised if you were to receive a request for recognition. Clearly, 22% of you feel that it's not appropriate to your organisation, and some of you are still unsure. So, yeah, let's see how 2023 unravels. Thank you, Sue.
Okay, thank you.
And that brings us on to the questions and answers now at the end of the webinar. So if you do have any questions, please do let us know if we had any come through, Sue.
Not at the moment, no. I think we've no
Okay.
Any technical ones that we've resolved. So no,
Okay.
I think we can.
Well, a copy of the slides from today will be sent out to you afterwards. So you've got that information to reference after today. And what you'll see on the training on this next slide is just if you're looking for any training courses, then this is just to let you know what we're offering right through until December, all to do with management training courses. And actually there's one on managing conflict at work. So, you know, conflict, if you're not unionised, then perhaps that might be something that may be of interest. So there's lots of different management training courses there, and I believe they're all online, virtual, isn't that right? Is that right, Sue?
Yes, they are all online. Yeah. And there are spaces available, one or two, so do get your reservations in quickly.
Brilliant. And we also do health and safety courses. These are always popular. These ones are in person, just because of the practical nature of the training and the subject. So we've got lots coming up right through until February, and even we've got a couple of dates that we're just sorting out in terms of the mental health ambassador and the safeguarding ambassador course. And for those of you who are regulars on our webinars, we run these every month. Obviously, they're free to join. We have December's, which is all about planning for the year ahead in 2023. And I suspect trade unions will be part of the content on that webinar, but there are lots and lots of other things too. So it's hopefully we'll see you on that webinar. It's the 8th of December at 10 o'clock, always a Thursday at 10. So you can register through our website here that's on the slide. And we're going to be shortly communicating the webinars for 2023, both for HR and health and safety. So I know early January, February, we are looking at the employment relationship and how to manage it, particularly obviously for those reasons we've just talked about in terms of the current employment climate. So we'll be communicating that very, very soon. So watch this space. And I just want to run a final poll, and it's more about whether you feel we can help you with any of our services that we offer. So Sue has kindly launched the poll. So if you'd like us to follow up with you, whether it's to do with training, HR services, health and safety services, our HR knowledge base, which is essentially where you can access all our templates. So template letters, policies. There's lots and lots of articles on every possible subject, including trade unions and working with them. So, or if you'd like us to follow up with you about payroll services. So do let us know and we can follow up with you.
Okay, I'll close that poll now.
Brilliant, thank you. And
here you go.
Thank you. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. So just want to thank you all for taking time out. I know it's really busy at the moment for everybody, so really appreciate you having us join us. We hope that you can join us in all our future webinars. Thank you to Sue and Drew in supporting as usual and helping run the webinar. So until next time, have a good day. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you.